Thank you for joining this online meeting / live webinar on biosimilars and generics in the treatment of MS. And specifically, we focus also on nursing considerations. So what is important on this topic relating also to the nursing practice. So this is a webinar by MS Nurse Pro. So I'm the project coordinator. My name is Stefan de Korte. And we have also Piet Elen with us and Amy Perrin-Ross as speakers. I will introduce them also later on, obviously. We had some 40 registrations for this webinar, so we were quite happy. And I'm also pleased to see that a few of them joined already at the start of the webinar. So we'll see whether a few more join in a minute. And I see, Alicia, that you registered and thought you enrolled and you didn't receive the link. Our apologies for this. So we sent out a reminder a few days ago. So indeed, it's good that you signed up again and received the link. So please do not hesitate to use the chat to ask questions as well, if you have any or you have a comment on the topic. So briefly on MS Nurse Pro, we are an active community mainly of European nurses caring for people with MS. And we offer courses, e-learning courses that are accredited by the International Council of Nursing. We are offering blog posts on hot topics, and we are also an active community where we organize, for example, also these live webinars where we meet one another. We will start organizing also a few best practice sharing sessions in future. We have some 7,000 users on our platform, of which more than 1,300 are active every year on the platform. So I do invite you also to go there and consume content. We try to offer everything we do in 13 languages, also today, if it's available, but I already received a comment, it might not be. We have captions available for you. And they should be also, you could choose your language. So it's on your screen, CC, it should be called. If it's not visible, we will investigate and we make sure that it will be offered for the next webinars we offer. Because we do want also to offer this live content in multiple languages. So that's about MS Nurse Professional. It's a project implemented and owned by the European MS platform, which is the patient association at the European level. And we implement the project together with Rehabilitation in MS, which is a network of rehabilitation physicians and practitioners, and IOMSN, which is the International Organization of MS Nurses. We are very grateful also for their support. So why do we do this webinar on nursing considerations? Well, generics and biosimilars, there is an increase in their availability, obviously. So we considered, and if I say we, it's our syllabus committee, which is the scientific committee, considered it important for nurse professionals to understand safety, efficacy, and also important the patient management aspects of these therapies. And therefore we will speak our speakers as well, and we will explore what generics and biosimilars are as a definition, how they relate to branded products. Sometimes quite often patients have questions on this. Then we'll explore the regulatory framework for generics and biosimilars and important the nursing considerations. The two first topics will be tackled by Amy, and the last topic, the nursing considerations, will be tackled by Piet. I see a few more people are joining, so welcome everybody. Very nice to have you here. So I'm Stefan de Korte. I'm the facilitator today, and I'm just going through the introduction, explaining why we do this. So this webinar is funded with the support by Sandoz. Important for us as well is that they were not involved in the elaboration of this specific program we have today for you, and neither on the presentations of the two speakers. And as you all may be aware, we are also, as MS Nurse Pro, multi-funded, and you see the names of the different companies that support our activities. So primarily it's a pharmaceutical and medical device industry. So before giving the floor to Amy and Pete, there will be a short pre-survey. That's the next step. We will keep it within 1 hour, this webinar. So we will have interventions from Amy and Pete, and then there is question and answer time. There's a short post survey, and then I will close. Okay. So I will launch now before I introduce Amy. If there are questions in the meantime, don't hesitate to post them in the chat. It's a polling. We will have 3 questions, and it will also be useful in the discussion afterwards. The first one will be, how confident are you in working with generics and biosimilars? It's a closed question. Then, do you have any experience in using it really in your clinical practice? And if you have or are not able to use them, why not? Or what are your challenges? Okay, so I will launch the first one, and I will give just a moment, and Paul, because it's the wrong one, the pre one, yes, voila. So I see there are 11 participants. I know there are also maybe, I think maybe all of them are nurses. So I will give you a few more seconds to reply. So I see somewhat confident, confident, and very confident. That's good. So nobody is not very confident, but I do see somewhat confident. So it demonstrates as well why we do this webinar to increase in a way also your confidence in this topic. So thanks for your inputs. I'll quickly share the results. Voila, so just for you to see a bit the feedback from the participants. Okay, then just a moment. I'll end this poll, my apologies. And then I have here, yes, I'll start this. So the second question I have for you is to write down your main challenges when using or not able to use generics and biosimilars. So I'll give you a few seconds. And it's an open question. So if you have any challenges or concerns, now is the time in a way to write them down. Any feedback? Let me see. So I will share the results. I hope you can see them on your screen. So there is indeed a patient concern, convincing patient to change, regulatory approval, and market acceptance. Was the feedback. I don't know whether you see that on your screen. But indeed, there is concern about the patient adherence, or at least willingness to change, and also the regulatory framework. So that's good to read, and it's also a topic that we will be talking about today. I will revert back to my screen. Good. So sorry, there were only two polling questions in this pre-survey, but I think on the one hand, it becomes clear what really the concerns are. It's relating to the regulatory framework, and on the other hand, the patient's willingness. And then, so let's, with that in mind, go to our first speaker. So happy to welcome Amy Perrin-Ross. And Amy is representing also IO-MSN, so the International Organization of MS Nurses, in the different governance bodies of MS Nurse Pro. Amy is an experienced nursing practitioner from the Loyola University Medical Center in the US. And and she is also the coordinator of the MS Center. She is board certified as a neuroscience nurse by the American Board of Neuroscience Nursing, and also by the multiple sclerosis nurse, as a multiple sclerosis nurse by the Multiple Sclerosis Nursing International Certification Board. So long names for institutions that add credibility to nurse professionals. And Amy is active within MS Nurse Pro, but also a variety of medical societies, including the American Association of Neuroscience Nurses, and also the American Association of Critical Care Nurses, the Multiple Sclerosis Society in the US, Multiple Sclerosis Association of America, and the International Organization of Multiple Sclerosis Nurses, and the Consortium of MS Centers. So a lot of organizations, which I think makes you very well connected with also your peers and other professionals to be informed on the latest innovations, but also the regulatory framework, which makes you fit for this webinar. And you have also published in various journals on nursing practice. So very happy to have you here, Amy, also on this early hour for you as an American citizen, to speak about, on the one hand, the definition, the relation to branded medicines, and also the regulatory framework. So I will now stop my presentation and I will give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, so much. All right, let me share my screen. Okay, great. So welcome, everybody. And as Stefan said, I'm Amy Perrin-Ross. I'm an advanced practice nurse at a large university medical center in the western suburbs of Chicago. And I've been doing MS for many, many years. I started in MS right before we had any of the disease modifying therapies. So I've seen many exciting times and I'm optimistic. I see many exciting times ahead with not only branded drugs and new treatments based on new mechanisms of action, but also with respect to the biosimilars and the generics in the treatment of MS. Go. Okay. So we start off with a question of what in the world is a biosimilar? People throw around terms biosimilar, generic, branded, unbranded medications. Biosimilar is a biologic medication that is highly similar to and really has no clinically meaningful differences from an approved product. And we often refer to that as a reference product or a branded product. So it has to be highly similar, and there, from a clinical perspective, can be no meaningful differences. So, how does a biosimilar compare to a branded product? Well, biosimilars are made with the same types of living sources. Biosimilars tend to be large molecules. They have the same route of administration. So, if the branded product or the resource product is given intravenously, so is the biosimilar. If it's given subcutaneously as an injection or intramuscularly, again, so does the biosimilar. The biosimilars have the same strength and dosage as the reference or branded product, and they also have the same potential treatment benefits as well as the same potential side effects. And again, when we think about biosimilars, we think about a similar product. There can be no clinically meaningful differences in terms of quality, safety, or efficacy. And I think this is an important point to make when we are talking with our patients about the possible use of biosimilars. Pete will talk a little bit about this as he talks about some of the nursing considerations. And I know some of you have mentioned that you have patient concerns. We in the US have a lot of patient concerns as well. I think back to the early days in epilepsy when generic medications were first produced. We had problems with tolerability. We had problems with breakthrough seizures in our seizure patients on seizure medications because the quality was different. All of that is now highly, highly regulated, and there can be no clinically meaningful differences in terms of the quality of the product, the safety, or the efficacy. So if we're asking our patients to consider using a biosimilar, they should have the confidence to know that the quality is there, that the biosimilar treatment is as safe as the branded product, and it's also just as efficacious. So it works just as well in the research clinical trials. So what's the difference between a generic and a biosimilar? Well, you can see here on both sides of the table. Starting on the left, generics. Generics must demonstrate bioequivalence. That means they must have the same safety data, they must have the same efficacy data. And these require data on pharmaceutical quality. So the pharmaceutical manufacturers have to produce data about the quality of their product. Generics are mostly small molecules produced generally by chemical synthesis. And some of the examples that we see in terms of generics in multiple sclerosis, for example, are gluteramine acetate, fingolimod, dimethylfumarate, just to name a few. I will tell you that in the US and very often in Canada, so all of North America, we have a number of generic therapies. And based on our regulatory issues and compliance issues, as well as our insurance and payer issues, in many respects in the US, we are required to use the generics. We cannot get coverage or insure payment for the brand names unless the patient has tried and not responded well to the generics. So we have lots of experience with generics. Biosimilars, excuse me, on the right-hand side of the slide, really are of biologic origin. This requires that the manufacturers reproduce the exact molecule. Manufacturers also are required to produce data on pharmaceutical quality, and biosimilars tend to be large complex molecules, as you can see on the bottom, that image is actually an image of a monoclonal antibody. They have to demonstrate biosimilarity using head-to-head comparability studies. So there have to be studies comparing the biosimilar to the reference product. And again, monoclonal antibodies are the most common of the biosimilars that we see in multiple sclerosis. So why do we even think about biosimilars? What's the impact or the potential impact, not only of biosimilars, but of the generics as well? From my perspective, MS is the second most expensive chronic condition to treat in the US, and the lifetime direct medical costs are estimated at about 5 million US dollars. Again, these are the direct medical costs. So MS, as you well imagine, is a very expensive disease to treat. Biosimilar medications are generally less expensive to develop than the reference products, due in part to an abbreviated clinical trial program. So the generics are also, they tend to be less expensive, but they do have to demonstrate equivalence. So what are some of the possible risks versus the benefits of biosimilars? Well, not only biosimilars, but generics, potential benefits. In many situations, this gives our patient population increased treatment options. Again, based on our payers in the US, many of our payers will not pay for a branded product, but they will pay for a generic or a biosimilar product. So if we didn't have the generic or the biosimilar, the patient wouldn't have that drug as a treatment option. Another possible benefit is a reduced cost, not only to the payers, but to the patients themselves, because in our country, we have required co-pays for our patients. So the third-party payers, the insurers, they pay a certain amount, and the patients are then required to pay additional costs. When we're using generics, very often there is no additional cost for our patients. So that makes a big difference, which allows access to affordable health care. One of the biggest roadblocks in terms of treating people with MS that they don't have access to affordable health care. They may be able to see a physician or a nurse practitioner, for example, but if they don't have access to the medication, that's a big stumbling block in terms of their treatment. What about some of the possible risks? Well, biosimilars have to meet the same standards of safety, quality, and efficacy. However, there may be possibly some tolerability issues. We see more tolerability issues in our patients with the generics. And the reason for that is very often the inactive ingredient in the generic pills, for example. Those can vary depending upon the manufacturer. Their patients sometimes experience side effects, things like itching, redness, some of those kinds of things, as a result not of the active product, but of the inactive ingredients. We don't really see that in terms of the biosimilars because they basically have to be coming from the same molecule. So when we're talking to patients about the possible benefits and risks, we have to weigh these issues with our patients. Again, many of our patients are interested in the branded products. They're not necessarily interested in a generic or a biosimilar. But if their healthcare provider doesn't have access to that branded product, biosimilars and generics offer a really good alternative for our patient. So what are some of the regulatory requirements for both biosimilars as well as new drugs? Well, we look at the differences and the comparison side by side here. New drug development. With respect to new drug development, we have to have a clinical indication. What disease state are we looking at impacting with this new drug? For example, the S1P modulators in MS or the anti-CD20 modulators. What are the actual indications? We then have to identify the pharmacodynamics and the pharmacokinetics of whatever molecule it is that we're studying. Once we have a good idea of those pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics, the companies will then move into those preclinical phases, some very small phase 1 and phase 2 trials, looking at the tolerability of the medication. And also, those are often trials that are done to find an appropriate dose to treat the clinical indication. And then finally, we look at molecular characterization and we move into the phase 3, which are the pivotal trials for new drug development. On the other hand, with respect to the biosimilar development, we look for confirmatory clinical studies on this biosimilar molecule. We look at the pharmacodynamics and the pharmacokinetics, and again, they have to match exactly with the reference product. We then go into the preclinical evaluation to make sure that the efficacy and the safety, as well as the tolerability of the biosimilar, is exactly the same as that of the reference product. And finally, then we look at analytical studies for the physiochemical and the biologic characterization of this biosimilar development. So they're developed almost in opposite ways, if you will. If we think about biosimilar studies in humans, biosimilarity is actually demonstrated by a totality of evidence. As I mentioned, we have to have structural, functional, pharmacokinetic, as well as pharmacodynamic equivalence, and clinically confirmed similarity in terms of efficacy, safety, and immunogenicity in a sensitive population. We have to make sure that the impact on the immune system is the same. We look at the confirmatory phase 3 studies in humans. These are clinical studies in the various sensitive indications. We then move into clinical studies in healthy volunteers, or sometimes patients also, again, here to assess the safety, focusing on the pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamics. We move into the preclinical phases where we're looking at small studies with respect to the early phases. And then finally, we get into the analytical studies for the physiochemical and the biological characterization. So as you can imagine, the size of the trials for the biosimilar development, as well as the intensity and the degree of the trials for the biosimilar development is different than what it is. We rely for the biosimilar development on those early studies and the phase 3 studies for the reference product. If we're using something that is identical, both clinically, safety-wise, and from an immunogenicity perspective. So what are some of the indications for biosimilar? Well, a biosimilar can meet requirements for approval in part based on data from clinical studies or studies that demonstrate safety and effectiveness and an appropriate use in whatever condition we're studying. Regulators then may approve, whether that's the EMA or the FDA, they may approve a biosimilar for indications or populations without direct studies in those indications or population if the manufacturer provides adequate scientific justification. If the manufacturer shows that there is bioequivalence in terms of efficacy, safety, and immunogenicity, the regulators don't necessarily provide a requirement for additional direct clinical studies. So the biosimilars don't have to go through and do yet again further large numbers of phase 3 trials. So what about interchangeability? This is something that is an issue with biosimilars. If we look on the left-hand side, the requirements for all the biosimilars, all of them, including those who are interchangeable, must be highly similar to, and as I mentioned, have no clinically meaningful differences from the reference or the branded product in terms of safety and efficacy. In order to be interchangeable, the biosimilars may have to undergo additional testing in order to be designated interchangeable. What does interchangeable mean? Well, interchangeable means that a biosimilar that is developed may be substituted without the intervention of the prescriber, subject to local laws. So if I prescribe a therapy and the payer decides that they want to use one or more of the biosimilars, they may do that without the prescriber's intervention. And this is an issue here in the States in terms of the ability of our third-party payers to choose which of the biosimilars or which of the generics they may want to use. And again, in my practice, I sometimes have to go back to these payers and say, look, my patient tried this generic and didn't tolerate it, developed a rash, developed a cough, or something of that nature. I need to go back to a branded product or use a different one of the biosimilars. So in my practice, I sometimes have to go back and fight to reverse this interchangeability. But if a biosimilar goes through and reaches the interchangeability designation, they can be changed without my approval. So an interchangeable biosimilar, here is a biosimilar, again, that may be substituted without intervention of the prescribing healthcare provider. Now, the thing to note is that not all biosimilars are interchangeable. The manufacturer of this biosimilar has to seek regulatory approval for an interchangeable product. So far in the US, we don't have interchangeable biosimilars. We have many interchangeable generic medications. I mentioned the difference in the two earlier on. Some additional requirements for interchangeable biosimilars. Well, in addition to establishing biosimilarity, the manufacturer of an interchangeable biosimilar needs to submit information to the regulatory bodies to show that the proposed product can be expected to produce the same clinical result as the reference product in any given patient. And the regulators then go back and evaluate that information on the effects of switching between a reference product and an interchangeable biosimilar. If they feel there are no adverse effects of switching between these products, they then give approval for interchangeability of that biosimilar. And again, in US, we don't have issues with interchangeable biosimilars yet. We have a lot of issues with interchangeable generics. So hopefully that was helpful to give you an overview of what a biosimilar is, what are the regulatory requirements, what are the things that we should be explaining to our patients and giving comfort to our patients in terms of the facts that biosimilars require similar efficacy, similar safety, similar tolerability, and hopefully similar effects. So on that note, I will turn the presentation over to my esteemed colleague, Pete.
Thank you, Amy. What a nice, complete theoretical approach of biosimilars. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Amy. I will quickly, Piet is the chair of the MS Nurse Pro Syllabus Committee, the scientific committee of MS Nurse Pro. And Piet is a clinical nurse specialist, specialized in MS, and he works in the National MS Center of Maelsbroek in Belgium. Piet was also a head nurse of a rehabilitation ward between 1990 and 2011, before moving on to the MS Center in Maelsbroek. And Piet also organizes courses for nurses to stimulate development and education, both in his center but also in Belgium. And Piet, as Amy, is associated with different international organizations. And he is also the president of the Belgian Association of MS Nurses. So, Piet, looking forward to the talk.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan, for the nice introduction. So I like to go with you through a more practical approach of the biosimilars and the generics, especially in our nursing practice. These are my disclosures. So I like to highlight these topics. So the challenges due to the increased complexity of the disease-modifying therapies. Nowadays, I like to highlight this firstly, and then to go to some strategies for successful management and some tools that can be used by nurses for nurses or for the persons with MS. But I like to start with this nice overview of disease-modifying treatments for MS. At this moment, we all know that the landscape of these drugs has evolved over the last 30 years enormously, especially the last 10 years, a significant increase in the different molecules used has come to the market. And also the oldest molecules are 20 to 30 years old, so those patents have expired, which opens the door for generics and biosimilars. Together with an increase of the number of molecules used goes an increase of the complexity of these treatment options and also an increase in the possible side effects to be managed. And so these different treatment options offered to the patients means also different challenges in the practical management of MS. First, we have to support the patient in making the correct choice between the treatment options. Secondly, we have to be aware, know, and navigate the specific therapy protocols which must be performed before initiating a treatment. Thirdly, manage through the different treatment strategies in case of escalation or switching. And finally, manage the increased complex and or unknown risk profiles. So it's quite complex, and I'd like to mention first, especially also with the evolving role of the MS nurse, and all in respect, of course, of the biosimilars and the generics. So the role of the MS nurse has also changed over those years. In the 1990s, I always say that the role of the MS nurse was rather a reactive, more pathology-oriented attitude and less an informative, educational attitude. Nowadays, current roles of the MS nurse are focused on providing personal education on disease management, building a relationship to promote shared decision-making around treatment options and symptoms management, raising awareness about the importance of lifestyle factors and supporting lifestyle interventions, emphasizing on the importance of prehabilitation, and through ongoing conversation and support, empower patients to take charge of their treatment journey. And this is already, let's say, like a specific attitude that we have to be aware of in supporting our patients in the disease-modifying therapies. And a few years ago, in this new era of follow-on disease-modifying therapy, an international multidisciplinary panel from different European countries, South American countries, USA and Canada, following a systematic review, formulated some overarching principles and several consensus statements on strategies to reduce barriers to the follow-on disease-modifying therapies. And these strategies mention, amongst other things, that it's important to report full and timely on data that is generated, so we can go on with the new drugs. And the pharmacovigilance has to go on, just like the pharmacovigilance for the biologicals. And it's important to offer complete but concise education. Was where the, let's say, the strategies from this research group. And consensus recommendations promoted by this group are shared decision-making between the persons with MS and the healthcare professional, empower the person with MS to assess evidence for efficacy and safety on follow-on DMTs, and coach and guide the patient to reduce unintended nocebo conditioning. More about that later on. So patient conversation is, in fact, an essential part in optimal care. Most important, some key principles here in patient communication are: take time to inform the patient, ensure the patient understands why they must take the medication. And I always say, like, in fact, it's like teaching the patient, but teaching and not without asking back. So you ensure that the patient understands what you just explained him. Guide, explain, and educate through all the treatment options. Ensure the continuity of information, education, and support after a change in medication. So follow-on consultations is one of those ways that can be a possibility to be certain that the information is going on and going on. Inform also on the specific and practical things of the new drug, if we have to be, when we switch to a generic or a biosimilar. Even small things like packaging of the medication or the number of pills in a package can be different. So it's important that we draw attention to small practical things for our patient also. And if necessary, initiate patient support programs and provide a lifeline to the patient in case of situations. These patient communication principles are nicely prescribed in some publications which are shown here. In a successful management, we have to be sure that all kinds of strategies are offered to our patients. So we have to draw attention to different things in the complete, and I like to mention it again here, in the complete treatment plan. Start prehabilitation as soon as possible. Patient education and communication, which I explained already a little bit. Timely and appropriate treatment. A personal follow-up planning, supporting adherence to therapy, monitoring and managing side effects, and when needed or when appropriate, rehabilitation. But all these management strategies can be applied by the MS nurse is more like a continuum, not like a linear support, start at the left side and then at the right side is the end, but it's more like a continuum where we as nurses can pick one of those approaches, attitudes, and inform our patient, and this in respect to successful management, of course, in general. Concerning strategies for navigating switching treatments, there is this nice article on why are education and communication so important, published in the information guide of ESNO, which is the European Specialist Nurses Organization. And they mention here that we have to be aware that 50% of patients that are taking medication for chronic conditions for long term aren't taken properly, which affect, of course, in patients' outcomes and long-term health. Switching itself can also affect whether patients take their medication properly, yes or no. So explaining and informing and supporting and informing persons with MS is so important and so needed. It's particularly important to improve patient adherence to medication, and if needed, re-inform about the pathophysiological process of MS, for instance. But so the patient is aware why he has to take the medication. Patient education and awareness are linked, to a better health outcome. So if we want to have our patient in good conditions with good health, we have to be aware that education and communication is needed. But I always say it also, be patient with your patient. Inform in steps, inform when needed. A small word about nocebo. I'd like to highlight nocebo, which is nicely prescribed in this paper here. Nocebo effects encompasses in research settings negative responses to inert interventions, and in clinical research or clinical practice, negative outcomes with an active treatment, including new or worsening symptoms and adverse events stemming from patients' negative expectations and not the pharmacological action or the treatment itself. Numerous personal, psychological, neurobiological, or environmental factors can contribute to the development of the nocebo effects. This can impair the quality of life, of course, and reduce adherence to treatment. So gaps in patients' or HCP's awareness, understanding, and perception of biosimilars can have a negative impact and may result in negative expectations and nocebo effect. It can also diminish their acceptance and clinical benefits. So again, awareness, understanding, communication, information, so important. At the contrary, when biosimilars are introduced to a patient with a positive approach, negative expectations can be prevented. Strategies as delivery of balanced information on risk-benefit profiles, framing information to focus on positive attributes, or promoting shared decision-making processes, along with patient empowerment, will have a positive approach on the treatment. So I like to end my small talk with some tools that we developed with some colleagues of North America. Amy was also one of the colleagues who participated, and some colleagues of Europe, and we developed a few tools. And this one first is an MS Nurse Pocket Guide, a brief reference document on the number of biosimilar related topics that MS nurses can use in conversation with their patients. So topics that are mentioned are the definition of biological and biosimilars, which was so nicely explained by Amy, the key difference between them, how biosimilars are developed and approved, brief guidelines on switching strategies, and an overview of potential benefits and biosimilars, and also shared expertise on other biosimilars. Another tool that we developed are infographics for patients on exploring biosimilars medicine and how they differ from other medicine groups. So in patient-friendly words or framing, here is explained the things that are important when switching to a biosimilar. And last but not least, sometimes it's quite complicated, even for us as nurses, which words are so much used and all those different definitions. So this is also a nice document, an infographic on demystifying, it's called like that, the language of biological and biosimilar medicine. And it provides all definitions of key terminology commonly used in the context of generics and biosimilars. I think that all these tools are at this moment, but maybe Stefan can confirm it, that these tools are available on MS Nurse Pro. So
Yes,
with this, thank you, Stefan. With this, I like to end my talk with these take-home messages. So an increasing complex treatment landscape has required changes to the practical management of MS, and the role of the MS nurse has also evolved to support patients via education and communication, two key principles for me, and patient conversation and supporting treatment adherence are key parts of successful patient care. So with this, I'd like to end my talk.
Thank you, Piet.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Piet. So what I wanted to do now is open the floor to all of you. I think also thank you, Amy. I think we got a good view, or better view, I hope, for most of you as well, on the definitions on the one hand, and then also on the regulatory framework, because there was some concern expressed also in the poll at the beginning about how similar the drugs are. And on the other hand, from Piet, on more the nursing considerations that put a lot of emphasis on communication with the patient and the nocebo effect. So a question I would have is if any of you who is here participating can share any life experience on any of these topics. I would be happy to give you the floor. You can also write or otherwise comment. I'll give a moment to raise your hand if you want to intervene. If not, I will ask Amy. So linking to the patient communication, can you share a bit of your lived experience with this and also the nocebo effect or any other concerns expressed by patients?
Sure. The nocebo effect is very prevalent. Patients in my practice are used to having access to branded medications, as I think many MS patients are, because the MS medications are relatively new. If you think about it, Pete showed that really nice timeline. And especially in the last 10 or 15 years, where we've seen the explosion of oral medications, as well as the intravenous, the anti-CD20s and other complex molecules like monoclonal antibodies. So the concept of a biosimilar or a generic to them is something that's new, and they very often come with this nocebo opinion that somehow what we're giving them is of less quality, of less efficacy, and many of them simply say they don't want it. Well, they may not want it, but if they want access to treatment because they simply can't afford it on their own, some of them are forced, if you will, into the use of these generics and or biosimilars. And one of my biggest roles is to share with them a little bit about how a biosimilar is developed, how it has to be bioequivalent, how it has to be equivalent in terms of efficacy and safety, so that they feel a bit more comfortable moving forward and giving it a try. That's the biggest role for me. I think that Pete pointed out quite well, because I can't engage in shared decision making if my patients aren't educated about what decisions they're making. They don't truly know, but are fearful based on a nocebo idea.
Is it then mainly that the brand is so strong that it sits in the mind of the patient?
Yes, indeed. And one of the issues, which I think is not a problem anywhere else in the world, is that the medications are advertised on television. And so people see commercials all the time, and they come in asking for the drug that they've recently seen on television, and those are the branded products.
I understand. It's like, to simplify, it's like you change a restaurant because they serve Pepsi and not Coca-Cola.
That's correct.
So, yeah. Okay. Okay, no, thank you. And Piet, linking to you, do you see in Belgium or in your practice concerns related to the regulatory framework about, yeah, they are not the same, or the regulatory framework? So do you need to explain that in Belgium on that end, beyond towards the patient, but in general, your colleagues, are there concerns about the approval procedures? Or
for the moment, I don't have that questions that much. Of course, there are so many differences here in Europe. I think regulatory rules are different from country to country. In Belgium, for instance, the original brand has to lower his price when a generic or a biosimilar is coming to the market. And so the prices are just the same, just to be aware that the money isn't an issue to choose for one or another medication. And often, of course, we just continue. We have now a few of the generics, the orals, and glatiramir acetate. But we just continue using the original brand.
Yeah.
So and maybe, yeah, that's the reason why there are not so many questions from the in my practice here.
Yeah, that's quite. So I think that is also an important message to our European nurses, that the EMA approves the drugs in Europe, also the biosimilars and generics, but then indeed there might be national regulations that have an impact on the price setting and the availability of biosimilars and generics. That's what I understand now, Piet.
Yeah.
So that is for sure for everybody as well to take into account.
Of course, in the Netherlands it's different.
Yeah.
And just the price of the drug is like an incentive to change. And then, of course, you have all the procedures and the things where you have to go through to guide your patient, to inform your patient, things that we discussed. But when the price, when the money, when there is not an issue, then it's a different.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, good. Thank you. I have two more polling questions to close, and it's about the same question as we asked in the beginning. How confident are you in working with generics and biosimilars? So we could measure a bit whether we managed to change your confidence, but do not feel obliged to answer confident or very confident, because just worthily reply to the first question. And then a second question is more about the webinar itself, whether you would speak positively to a friend or a colleague. It helps us as well to come to learn from how we manage these webinars. Like myself, I got some feedback that I was showing the slide notes instead of only the slide in my introduction. So my apologies for that already. But happy to see that, many are more confident at least than at the beginning of this webinar. So this is good. Also, so I will share if it's feasible. I will end the poll now, and I will share the results so you can have a look. Allow me then, before I formally close, to share again the presentation. Because I want to highlight a few what's next for MS Nurse Pro. So I hope you see the slide. So we are working on the workload of nurses, mainly European nurses, and we aim to publish in the coming months on this. We assessed where you as MS nurse invest most of your time, and what the challenges are to do really the tasks that you want to do for your patients. And we will have some recommendations towards mainly policymakers to advocate for systemic change. So we will keep you up to date on this. We will also, in 2025, this year we recreated course 1 and course 2, but of course there are new diagnostic criteria. So it will be important to renew course 3 on diagnosis and assessment. And I see Piet as chair of the scientific committee nodding, so happy that you are motivated, Piet. And then also an important care and support. We talked a lot about patient communication, and I think there will be some on that as well in course 5. So both courses will be updated. And then beginning of 2025, we are planning to organize with Gavin Giovannoni a webinar on self-management. It was also a bit mentioned by Piet today as one of the roles of a nurse to support patients to self-manage their condition. So that we aim to do in early 2025. So I invite all of you to stay tuned and sign up on our web platform or on our newsletter to follow up on these activities. Voila, so thank you, Amy, thank you, Piet. Also, thank you, participants. You are part of a broad community of hundreds of nurses in Europe and beyond. You complete courses, and by that, we aim to reach many of our patients through you as trained nurses and well-informed nurses. So thanks for joining. We will post the recordings of the 2 talks also on the platform. We will write a blog post on it as well. So we will keep working a bit on this important topic. Thank you, and have a nice end of year, and see you back in 2025. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.